Okay. So I plan to do an evolutionary approach to gender. And one of the reasons I decided to do this is that gender and sexuality come up a lot in the text. And so having an evolutionary approach and an understanding, I think, could be very informative. And I find that a lot of people don't apply evolution or think about gender in this way. And there were also some comments in our discussion post, depending on which class you might have seen them, that I, kind of wanted to address in some way through this, although I could spend more time on that too. Okay, so just basically, we need to know this, is that there are two mechanisms that drive evolution. And so I want to say there's really actually one mechanism, and it's actually useful to think about too, because you can think about the whole COVID-19 issues, the whole COVID-19 thing through the mechanism of evolution, which is that viruses, just like people, just like genes, the whole goal of evolution is for the organism or the thing we're talking about to get into the future. And so sometimes this is at the level of the gene, not at the level of the organism. So some genes can be maladaptive, for example, but they can still continue on and persist as long as the organism reproduces. And so this is also why Richard Dawkins, who you see off to the right, he's famous for having written this book called The Selfish Genes. And people often criticize this book because they say, well, genes aren't conscious. How can they be selfish? Well, that's true. Genes aren't conscious. It's more of a metaphor. So they aren't actively being selfish, but those that don't get into the future don't survive. And this also applies to entire organisms like us. And so there are many things that we do and we act upon unconsciously that we're not aware of, but have to do with our evolutionary past. And I included this quote because I think this is really great from Dawkins. And he says, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. Let us understand what our own selfish genes are up to, because we may then at least have the chance to upset their design, something that no other species has ever aspired to do. Oh, shoot. Here we go. Okay. So, so general stuff about evolution. And can you guys see this, or is it getting cut off? I'm hoping you can see it. Oh, cool. All right. So while evolution is a controversial topic, the science of evolution, and I kind of start this at the outset because I know when I ask my classes, generally speaking, there are a couple of things that my classes tend to disagree with me about, and evolution is one of those things. So the science isn't controversial at all. We really should accept evolution. And I really would say, if you don't believe in evolution, to try to take what's called a compatibilist approach. You don't have to throw out everything else and all your other values, but just add evolution to those values. And so many people are able to do that. But here's why you should believe in evolution and why it's important. We really couldn't have good conversations about COVID-19 without understanding it through evolution. And as many of you know, COVID-19 is believed to have jumped from different species through a species of bat. So understanding how COVID-19 has been so successful can give us a better chance at fighting the virus. So one of the ways that it's been successful recently is that you can't always tell that you have it. So many people are asymptomatic, and that means that they can go around spreading the virus. So a really bad virus that was incredibly virulent and killed people very quickly, let's say like Ebola, wouldn't spread as rapidly. And that's one of the reasons why Ebola hasn't been as devastating as it could have been. We couldn't also have discussions about GM food. If you ask people about genetically modified food, people get very worked up, but you couldn't even enter that conversation if you didn't believe in evolution. We couldn't have conversations about the efficacy of gene editing and things like CRISPR. You probably heard of this in talks of designer babies. And we couldn't have discussions about antibiotics and antibiotic resistance, which is a huge, huge problem that we're facing and that we're quickly approaching, very similar to the COVID-19 problem, which many people like Bill Gates say we could have avoided had we been better prepared. So these are reasons why you should consider believing in evolution, even if it's something that you've been taught not to believe. And I do want to say there generally is only one reason that scientifically literate people don't believe in evolution. And I think many of you already know what that is. And there's a similar reason why there are some who believe in evolution, but just not for people. And that's especially true in the English department. They'll accept arguments for why the salamander mates and does what it does and acts the way it does, why chimpanzees will mate and act the way they do. But if you apply those same theories and that same evidence to people, people become upset. And that's something that I've had to, that I've witnessed quite frequently. Okay, so I know I'm going pretty fast. This is recorded, so you can go back and watch this again, and I'll put this the slides up on the Canvas site. Any questions so far? No? Okay. All right. So I said only one mechanism, but it really is two mechanisms, but both have kind of the same goal in mind, which is to get into the future. So there are two mechanisms that drive evolution. One is natural selection, which is basically survival. We must survive. We must get enough energy to live. So we must get food, and we must avoid pathogens and predators, which is to not become food. And then the one that we're focusing on today is sexual selection. And this one often gets forgotten about. Most people understand the natural selection side of things, that you must survive, but you also have to survive long enough to reproduce. So if you, and you also have to reproduce. So if you survive, but you never reproduce, then you don't pass on your genes. And so from an evolutionary perspective, reproduction is very important. And really quickly, an important side note is that there is no one set of genes that is best. So when it comes to natural selection, people think of the survival of the fittest. There's no one set of genes that would survive best, because there are different environments. So genes interact with environments to be successful. So one set of genes which may be successful in one environment may be a negative in a different environment. Okay. And then really quickly, I wanted to define some terms. So early in the class, you recall that last unit, I began the session with, okay, let's define some terms. So write down what racism is, write down what institutional racism. And so it's useful to define terms to make sure we're talking about the same thing. And this is where I think the people who believe in evolution but don't believe it for humans, where they get caught up because they're working on different terms. And so one of those terms is gender. And so more and more popular especially in the humanities, gender has come to mean gender expression, which there's a famous, I forgot her name. There's a famous gender critic who says there are basically as many genders as there are people, because people all express their gender in different ways. And so I think that that's pretty accurate in a sense, that this is how we express gender. And so I want to differentiate between gender and biological sex, right? So those two things are not perfectly synonymous. At the same time, biological sex can also be represented multiple ways. And so we see, just if we were just focusing on chromosomes, some people have a very simplistic view of that, and they simply say it's all XX or XY. Many are XX and XY, but there's also XXX, XXY, and XYY, though some of these are extremely rare, about 1 in 1,000. So you could say that mostly people fall into two categories. And even trans people tend to fall into two categories. So those who identify as trans often identify as one of the two genders, but just the opposite one. Okay. When we talk about evolution, as it applies to gender or anything, we also want to keep in mind that we're not talking necessarily about how we evolved in our current environment. Our current environments look nothing like the environment in which we have evolved in. So we're often referring to what's called the EEA, which is the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And so I'm just going over a lot of terms. These might be useful. You don't have to memorize all of them. I'm not going to have a test on them, but you might find these interesting and useful, especially when you take your other classes. But I think it's a great way to look at literature and to learn the biology, because it's a really cool lens to see movies, literature, culture through. Okay, so then lastly, we have inclusive fitness. This, is the combination of natural selection and sexual selection. Basically, what gives somebody an advantage? What gives someone more opportunity to maximize the number of copies of themselves? So what improves one's survival and ultimately their reproduction? And we're going to see some examples where something could increase survival, but decrease opportunity for reproduction, and something could increase the opportunity for reproduction while decreasing the opportunity for survival. So those two things can be conflicting, but it's sort of like the net benefit we want to think about it, or the net cost. Any questions so far? Okay, so I think we're doing good. All right, so next, I wanted to go over some important side notes. Is that as I talk about evolutionary theory and these things, we want to try to avoid falling into what I call, and what many people have referred to as, the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something is evolved, that doesn't make it right, or that doesn't make it good. And I can't drive that home enough. Some people call this David Hume refers to it as is does not equal or equate to ought, or you can't get ought from is, and meaning you can't determine how society should be and what is good just by analyzing how they are. Although I argue you do need to figure out how things are so that you can better understand how you can get societies to what you want them to be. So having more information by understanding the science, by understanding evolution, is generally a good thing, in my opinion. So also, as the Dawkins quote mentions earlier, we should understand what has evolved so we can shape our environments and our social pressures, be more generous and be more altruistic to create the world we want to live in. So that's that again. And if we don't understand evolution, this can lead to some poor policy choices that can have the opposite effects in society. And if I got to think of some examples, like one would be, this might not be a perfect example, but when they put that explicit content label on, back in the day, it was like CDs, that actually had the reverse effect for a lot of music, and young rebellious kids actually ended up buying more CDs and listening more to the content. So what was supposed to deter young people actually had the opposite effect, because people didn't understand the minds and the choices and the psychology behind why people might want to listen to that music. So so one thing, for example, one value that that the US tends to have, is that we want to live in free societies. So this value is a way in which we might push back against some of the evolutionary drives. So for example, thinking of COVID-19, within that context, you'll notice that I think the US has surpassed China in overall cases, even though China has more people. And one of those reasons is that we do have that value of wanting to live in a free society. And so that has a negative impact in terms of overall survival. So because we haven't had such draconian measures to keep people from leaving their houses. Because you can imagine that if nobody left their house for 2 weeks, and no one had any contact with other people, if extreme draconian measures were done, then the virus would be extinguished. And so that has helped the virus. But it's just something that we value as a society. And I will say too, when it comes to gender expression, in free societies, people should be free to express gender as they wish, whether there are biological reasons for that or not. And so that is also something that's really important, and I can't emphasize enough. And then lastly too, as I talk about this, I have to do it in a very short period of time, and it is generalized. So you will find plenty of exceptions to some of these examples. And I often call this I have an uncle who smoked smoked a pack a day until they were 90, who didn't get lung cancer. That's true. You're going to find exceptions when you have a large number of people or examples. But we're kind of talking about whether something's generally true in the aggregate sense. And so here's another example. So I didn't necessarily hunt around for the best. This is called a bell curve chart for men and women for height, but this one seemed pretty good, and it's from Our World in Data. And so this shows the average height for men, and it shows average height for women. And so it would be, so while you can see, and in fact, I would fall somewhere over here. So I would be, oh no, somewhere over here. I would be a little over 1 standard deviation shorter than the average male. And so you'll find plenty of women who are taller than I am, yet I am still slightly taller than the average woman. And so if so you can do this for anything. These are average differences. So while somebody could do this for just like something like hand strength, let's say, you're going to find women with incredible hand strength. So like, let's say Ronda Rousey's probably somewhere over here. I still wouldn't want to get in a fight with Ronda Rousey. So you're going to find plenty of exceptions to these rules. So this is just a bell curve. You can see that there are average differences, but there are men and women with the traits every level of the distribution. And you'll see too, the extremes are rare for both men and women. So hopefully that helps you see that we're talking about generalized information. We're not talking about individuals here. Okay. Okay, so why are there these differences? What have caused gender differences? And so the easiest way is to just ask yourself, well, how many children can men have? Generally, oh, go ahead, Natalie.
Oh, sorry. I would say, I don't know, just taking a wild guess, maybe unlimited, I guess. I don't know.
Right, it's pretty unlimited. So the record is believed to be Genghis Khan, and it would be in the thousands. And so women, the maximum amount has been somewhere in the 60s. And this is somebody who had more than one child per time. But there's huge risk every single time a woman has a child. Just from childbirth. And we want to think not just in modern society, but in hunter-gatherer society, uh, it wasn't as uncommon for women to die through childbirth. So this was incredibly risky. So when you just think about the risk and the investment it takes to have a child, it's very, very different between men and women. And I think most people know this to be true. Like, this is pretty obvious for your lay person, but more and more, some of my colleagues with PhDs by their name try to deny that there are forces at work that aren't simply just cultural. And so this can give us some insight into why men and women are treated differently, not just in society, but in our book too. We do see different treatment for like Beto versus how Gabi is treated. And so one thing to keep in mind is, while there's different investment levels, so it's not surprising that women tend to invest more in their children than men do. Human men are still what are called high MPI species. So meaning that human men do invest heavily in at least one household. And I think some people kind of know what I mean by that. Okay, so any questions so far? Okay, good. All right. So we can do questions at the end too. So moving on, I actually left a stock photo for my Pages PowerPoint, but it worked perfectly here. So because of parental investment, well, what do we get from that? Well, that means that when women are choosing their mates, when they're selecting mates, they need to be more choosy because there's greater risk involved, right? Because they have much fewer opportunities for reproductive success. So that's almost why we see, marriage as a pretty common phenomenon across cultures and across time. Okay, but on the other hand, men must compete for women's affection. So that's kind of why the marriage works, is they have to show that they have not only have strong genes for survival, but that there's a future likelihood of reproduction for sons. So if they also have to have good genes for the likelihood of reproducing. So they have to be desirable. And they have to have resources. So they have to have resources to provide for the children, and otherwise the children have less likelihood of surviving. And so just, out of curiosity, I would challenge those watching either right now or in the future to think, what qualities are must-haves for you when choosing a mate? And when you think about that, you'll probably find that for the men probably have two things that they look for, whether they're looking for a short-term mate or a long-term mate. A lot of men will say they're looking for attractiveness, but when thinking about a long-term mate, they also want somebody who would not only have good genes and be attractive, but somebody who would make good mothers and be faithful. And for women, and that faithfulness would be they're focusing more on sexual fidelity. Women tend to, well, when I talk to young women, they usually say they want three things. So they care about uh, having a job, a car, and height. So which are proxies for, again, having good genes, being able to survive, being able to provide, and all three of those are proxies for that. Any questions so far? No. Okay. All right. Good. And I will say, the job thing, just to be fair to women, it's not that they care so much about the money. They care about the being able to provide for future family members if that should happen. So I have a couple examples with animals here. And you'll notice I've included some human examples because humans are animals too, and we evolved too. So here you'll see two male rams, and they're fighting one another. Only the male rams have these large horns, and these large horns are used for for male to male combat to compete for the reproductive access to ewes. So it's one of the ways in which they practice their sexual selection. And so these horns are incredibly heavy. They cost energy. So this would actually lower natural selection, their inclusive fitness from a survival standpoint, because they're not useful in that domain because they're not used against predators. They're purely used for sexual selection. Here's another example that's very similar, which is the peacock's feathers. You'll notice that male birds and male peacocks are the ones that are brightly colored, and so this also lowers their chances of survival because it makes them more vulnerable to predators. But it is what's called a costly signal. So a costly signal means that they're showcasing how good their genes must be because they can afford to have this lavish, extreme tail. And you'll see some similarities over here too. You can apply that to humans as well. These are penguins. Penguins give a stone to their prospective mate to signal their loyalty and their ability to provide. And many birds create lavish nests to show that they can provide. Also, many birds are brightly colored, just like the peacock, to showcase as a proxy of good genes. And humans too. So while we didn't evolve in a society with diamond rings uh, and Ferraris, the fact is that diamond rings are costly signals. So whatever could signal wealth would be attractive to females for humans, or for women, or the more choosy gender, I should say. And that is why we see men driving. More men are interested in fast cars, and why it's recommended for men to save up 3 months' salary to buy an expensive diamond ring. Because if it's not costly, if it's not an honest, costly signal, then it doesn't adequately show to their prospective mate that they are committed. Okay. And I have a picture here. So one of the things with evolution is that it is looking at human universals, or universals in general. It's using, and sometimes cross-species universals. So when we see examples over and over and over again that are consistent across a range of species, that's pretty good evidence that it's not cultural, but has an evolutionary background. And so, for example, a happy face, a neutral face, and a sad face are human universals. These mean the same thing across all cultures across history of time, and that means that there's fairly good evidence that that's brought about through evolution. Now, any questions so far? Okay. I've already hit my deadline, but I'm gonna go a little long because this is fun for me. So I've been really interested in how online dating allows us to track interactions between men and women just people in general. So what does the data show? And right now we're focusing on heterosexual couples, but there's some evidence to show that some of these arguments are also true of homosexual couples, that they follow some of the same patterns. So what does the data say about us? Well, it shows that women are more choosy. So let's say you have a male in the top 80 percentile of attractiveness, so the top 20% of men here we're looking at, he would be able to date up to the about, let's say, 25 or 30% female attractiveness. And so I kind of feel odd about talking about male and female attractiveness because it is pretty shallow. But let's say you have a woman who is, let's say she's right in the middle. She's at 50% of attractiveness. She would be able to date all the way up to about the 95th percentile of men. And so what does this mean? It means that the data, that the numbers are skewed in favor of women and in favor of men in the top 5 to 20 percentile. And so that means that many women reproduce, but not all men reproduce. And some people probably know this to be true. If you just look at your family trees and you go back far enough, you'll find that most women have children, but not all men have children. Okay, and some more evidence that we can see this is true. This is some data from, I believe this is OkCupid. This looked at the number of messages sent by age, and you can see men are really reaching and trying to send as many messages as possible. Women don't have to try so hard. They don't have to send many messages. And I would actually want to do a study to look at number of words in one's bio. Well, I don't know, actually. Maybe I would be wrong about this, but I would assume that that even if the female wrote less in her bio, it would be likely not affect the number of messages she received. Whereas the opposite probably wouldn't be true for men. I don't know. That's just a theory I'm throwing out there. Okay, and if you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that the number of messages that a man gets by income is impacted. And so people already kind of know this to be true. If a guy is 24 or older and makes less than $40,000 a year, he's not going to get any messages. So this is why the guys in the class should really focus on their education. So education doesn't mean you automatically make more money, but the data shows that those with the bachelor's degree make $1 million more over their lifetime. So that can help you in this domain for the young men in the class. Now, again, I would say that doesn't mean that women are shallow or that women care only about money. They care about the security. When I talk to most women, that's what they say. And so we would expect that this wouldn't be yellow over here if that were the case, that they only cared about money. It seems reasonable that after about 40,000, then people can afford a pretty comfortable lifestyle to some degree. But I will say this is kind of bleak for men because the average income for an individual in the U.S. is only about $22,000 to $25,000. So you have to be outperforming the average by quite a lot here. Okay. And here are some big takeaways before I try to apply this to Gabi, which is that humans are animals too, and they evolve too. And this applies all the way to the human mind in ways that we are conscious of and unconscious of. There are average gender differences interacting with culture and environment. So while these differences exist, they are going to be different depending on the culture we're in. And in some ways, or in many ways, we ought to push back against these evolved differences. We want to think about that freedom of society. That means that whether there are biological reasons why somebody might be gay, for example, we should want to live in a free society, so it should be up to them and their choice. Although there is some biological evidence that there's a genetic component to homosexuality. And in fact, the evidence seems to point that it is an evolved advantage because about 10% of every mammal on Earth is homosexual. And so it's not, in fact, it's kind of surprising that bisexuality isn't more common because that doesn't seem to have much of a cost to it at all. Okay, so we can apply an evolutionary lens to our readings. Okay, so just as you can apply a historical lens, a Marxist lens, a feminist lens, or a reader response lens. And so I mentioned some of these because these are some of the lenses you will apply in your English 1B classes. One of my favorite professors who does this is Mike Schwartz. I highly recommend him. You can also apply an evolutionary lens. And so we could ask the question, well, how does Gabi, a girl in pieces, represent gender and gender differences throughout the story? And what does evolution tell us about these differences? And one of the reasons I was really interested in this, oh, you can see the ring too. I didn't even think of that. That might be her. Is that her left hand? Is that I felt that a lot of the guys in the text, and it would be me to focus on guys because I happen to be a guy myself, but I thought a lot of the representation of the guys wasn't so favorable in the text. So I think this is really interesting. Um, and another quick note. Okay, so to help to do this, one thing I think we should understand is that there's an intersection of culture and evolution. So we get glimpses into an older, more traditional value system in the Gabi, a Girl in Pieces, right? And it's interesting to think of why might those older traditional values have evolved in the first place. So it could be that they were beneficial at one point in society when society was very different and harsher. Birth control, for example, is only a recent phenomenon in human history. It's not surprising that it's hard for values to catch up to where we are in terms of our technology. So we could see why some of these values might have existed. So the idea of no sex before marriage, this was meant to get commitment from the male first. So if you remember what I was talking about over here, when we think of choosing a mate, that women need to be more choosy, because if the male, if they have a child and the male doesn't invest in their children, in their family, then the child has less chances of surviving. And this is also true because, like I said, there's very little cost to men. So, if we think about our evolutionary environment, it would have been very wise for men to invest heavily in one family, but it wouldn't be as costly for them to also just try to have more children with other women. And so it's also not surprising that we might see more men cheating in given if evolution is true. Although women might cheat too. So there's some reasons why women would want to cheat with this knowledge. So male aggressiveness, or what's often referred to as machismo, could be seen and viewed as a display of inclusive fitness. It could be a way that men try to, again, just like the rams compete with each other for the attention of female ewes, it's not surprising that men compete with each other, just in general. And I actually kind of like to notice this and watch this when I see department meetings and meetings with faculty. You'll notice that there are differences in who talks and how much they talk and how they talk. And so you can actually see evolution play out even in just our interactions with our friends. Okay, marriage is an institution, right? If two people work together to raise children, there'll be more support for children, and this will lead to higher survival rates. And this was, more true in our early environment. In the U.S., there's some data to show that households with two biological parents is better for children. But we've seen more and more non-traditional families that are incredibly successful. So it's less true today. And then cheating, generally men care more about sexual infidelity, because the worst thing for men from an evolutionary standpoint is to invest heavily in a child that isn't genetically theirs, because then they're investing in getting somebody else's genes, to pass on. And then for women, the worst thing that they tend to find is emotional infidelity. So it's less worse for for their partner to sleep with somebody else. The access to resources and the commitment is what women tend to care more about. And this is just a generalization, because I think most people find cheating in general to be upsetting. Okay, and then last, we could apply this to some aspects of the text. So I just picked out a couple quotes really quickly. but this should become immediately clear when you see this. So this was Sebastian's dad who said this. He said that the two worst things that could happen to a man are that his wife sleeps with another man and that his son is gay. And so we can see this from a reproductive standpoint. If his wife sleeps with another man, well, then there's an opportunity, there's a chance that his son could not be his. And so he would be investing in a child that isn't genetically his. And if his son is gay, well, then that would be the end of the of reproduction potentially. And so we could see how evolution could lead to, or just a purely evolutionary view could lead to bigoted views. But again, remember, just because something is natural, that doesn't make it right. And then here's another quote. This one was from Gabi, this also referring to Sebastian. So Sebastian has been saying that if his parents don't accept him, it doesn't matter because he doesn't need them. I have been telling him that this is ridiculous. They need each other, their blood, family, familia, right? And so we see that families do tend to invest more in one another because they're going to be more altruistic. This is why people will do more for their families, or why they give more expensive gifts to their families, and allocate more resources and money, is because they share genes. And so theoretically, a sibling has 50% of your genes, and so you're going to be very altruistic towards siblings. If you have a genetic identical twin, you would be almost perfectly altruistic with your genetic twin, for example. And they've even shown that too. Biological parents invest more in children's college funds, etc. And so genes really do matter in this regard. Even though we evolved with no understanding, no concept of the genetics. Okay, so the next quote, this one was Gabi's mom, and she told this to Gabi. She said, "I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation, but no seas Afraseta. I'm gonna get it totally wrong. Sorry about that. But basically, what she was saying was, don't be too forward. You have to play coy. You have to be hard to get. And again, that goes back to the evolutionary idea that women should be more choosy because they need to make sure that they get commitment from the opposite sex. And then the last one, which probably needs very little explanation for the evolutionary connection, which is, my mom should have taken her own advice. Ojos abiertos, piernas cerradas. Okay, and with that, let's go to Q&A. And these are some books I recommend if you want to learn more about evolution and how they shape human choices and human psychology. Any questions, Natalie and Azucena, while I got you?
No, I finished reading it. I thought it was interesting. The Gabi. It was a good.
Oh, that's great. Well, then that actually gives you more time to focus on maybe your other classes if you're done reading. It was an easier read than you thought, right?
Yeah, there wasn't. I felt like there was a lot crammed into 270 something pages, but it kept my attention and I finished it in like 3 days. So it was
Congratulations.
a good read.
Do you have any questions for me? Hopefully this is an interesting way of thinking about the text.
Yeah. I just, besides these books that you have written on here, do you have any other recommendations
um,
that are your personal favorites?
my personal favorite. Well, so I've taught using the consuming instinct before. That one's really accessible.
Okay.
There's a guy named Geoffrey, starts with a G, Geoffrey, or he might pronounce it Jeffrey Miller. He's an evolutionary psychologist. He has some talks online, and his wife is also an evolutionary psychologist, something Fleischman. I think it's Diana Fleischman. She has some good YouTube talks online. I would recommend some of their work.
Okay.
Because it's really accessible and it's available through just like YouTube. So you can just turn it on and listen. But you could just type in evolutionary psychology into YouTube and probably you will see something by Geoffrey Miller or Diana Fleischman. They're younger and they publish a lot on new media, and those would be really good resources. And I believe I've found, I don't know if it's legal, I found Geoffrey Miller's textbook in PDF format online, and so that is there. I don't know how it got there, and whether that's good or bad, but that's there. Did that help? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Actually, if you email me, I'll be happy to send you a ton of links because I found this theory to be incredibly fascinating, and it drastically changed my perception of a whole range of human problems and how we look at even how we look at mass incarceration, because there is differences by gender, how we look at things like bullying. So just like how men compete with other men, women are competing with other women, and so bullying in the workplace among women is another problem. And so it gives you a different lens to see the world, and it was one that was far more complex than just the simplicity of saying the world is a patriarchy, which it is male dominated to some extent, but it's way more complicated than that. Any other questions?
I think Azucena had a question on the chat.
Oh, okay, I didn't see it. Sorry about that. Let me see how I can see that. Oh, here we go. Oh, the machismo. Oh, that's a great question. Give me a second to think of some specific examples. Um, and maybe I'm not using the right definition, but there was a part where help me with the name too if I get this wrong. One of the characters, the character I think was Cindy's, her baby's father, he said something like, I was trying to do you a favor, that sort of attitude, if people didn't want to go out with him. I thought that might have been an example, or one example. There was an issue which I didn't like, and I don't know where it comes up in the book, so I don't want to spoil it for anybody, where Beto kind of makes a fist and does something, that I wasn't happy with their mother. And I thought that could be read as an example of this machismo view. And certainly Sebastian's dad is another perfect example. And there's like only one good character. It's not, is it Eric? I see, this is why you should make a list of the characters, because I tend to get character names confused. But Gabby's boyfriend, her dad, it's almost as if they represent it as if her dad taught her good, or taught him good values and proper values. And certainly that's true that that culture can play a role, and we can teach people to be good human beings. But kind of one of my pushbacks is that most men aren't these awful monsters, I would say, or I guess I could be wrong, but I do see that there was this sort of theme of this sort of machismo, or this sort of toxic masculinity in the text. And this helps give you a different lens to see why that might be apparent. Did I answer your question, Azucena? Give me a thumbs up or just say yay if I did. Natalie, did you have any more questions?
No, that's it. Thank you so much.
Oh,
I
you're
talked
welcome.
about
Oh,
machismo too on my QCQ for Azucena. It's on I don't know if you've gotten that far, but on page 229, that's kind
oh,
of
that
where.
you did? Okay. Oh, I'll well, out of curiosity, I have it right here. Let's see, 229. Is that
Yes.
further, guys?
It's where Gabby makes a list of boys with boys.
Yeah, that's a great example. Boys will be boys. Yeah, the instructions for understanding what boys will be, and of what boys will be, boys really means. So you're wearing that little dress tonight. Remember, boys will be boys, so be careful. Oh yeah. And so that is a different treatment. So parents do treat their daughters different than their sons, and um, it's not fair. It just isn't. But I would argue that it's not fair, but there are biological realities that are different between men and women, and there are more risks for women. And I don't know if that makes me sexist to say that, but it's something worth understanding. And while we wish we lived in a perfect reality where, uh, well, no, this is just talking about what they're wearing, right? So I guess I would say, no, I'm changing my mind in real time here. No, yeah, women should be able to wear whatever they want, and boys should be respectful, obviously. Okay. But yeah, that's a great example of that maybe perhaps that value system. But I think I can at least empathize and understand why some parents would be concerned and treat their daughters differently. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, so in that case, uh, I will end the presentation, and hopefully this was entertaining. And if you do have questions or want more reading, just send me an email. So looking forward to seeing more of you through Confer Zoom. This is going to be the probably the best way to interact with me, since we're no longer to do face to face, but email works too. And I can also set up a Confer Zoom if people want to interact with me. We could schedule something, and you just want to ask me general questions, but you want it, not through typing, but just kind of real time.